Today, I'm speaking with Dr. James Johnson. Dr. Johnson is an archaeologist specializing in the Ancient Western Eurasian Steppe. This is the belt of grasslands running from Eastern Europe to Khazakstan, where horses were first domesticated, the wheel was first used in war chariots, and from which the Indo-European language family spread to cover 2/3 of the world. He's been working on the steppe for over a decade, with projects in the southern Urals region of the Russian Federation and east-central Ukraine. My name is Sebastian Weatherby, and without further ado, this is The Tell. You have a really, really impressive bookshelf. I recognize a handful of these, but I need to take a picture so I can go through and find some of these online. Well, anyway, hi, Jim.
I had, so when I finished my master's, I sold half of my books off. So these are the ones that made the purge and kind of made it through the PhD program. And then, of course, there's a bunch. I mean, there are a bunch back at the house. Like I said, there's a couple bookshelves that are the academic stuff. And then there's all the other fantasy, sci-fi.
How did you get into the archaeology of the Pontic steppe in particular? I can see from your bookshelf that you really like European prehistory in general and ancient history. And like a lot of people who are history geeks, they like the Romans, they like the Greeks, they maybe like the Celts or something. But how did you go from there to the Bronze Age steppe and the Iron Age steppe?
Yeah, so, the long answer is that I actually started off being really interested in the Neolithic and early Bronze Age monuments of Northwest Europe. Mm-hmm. So the UK, Ireland. Mm-hmm. And then I realized that, because this was when I was making that transition from undergraduate to graduate, I just didn't have the money to go to Europe a lot. And that's when I actually met Bettina Arnold, Professor Bettina Arnold at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee. And she got me really interested in the Iron Age and the Celtic Iron Age more specifically. So I was able to go to Germany with her, like right after doing my field school. And this was back in 2000. 3 days later, I was on a plane to Germany to excavate burial mounds in southwest Germany. There was that transition. And as I kind of progressed through the master's program at UW-Milwaukee with Professor Arnold, I started to think more about Eastern Europe because not many people were interested in it at the time. Mm-hmm. We all, had heard about like Scythians or Scythians, depending on how you want to pronounce it. And of course, their interactions with the Greeks, I think that it's almost mirrored by the Celtic interactions with the Greeks. Mm-hmm. So looking at that aspect of the Iron Age, the Eastern European and Eurasian steppe. And again, like you just don't hear much about it. I thought, well, here's a place where I could really make my mark, help illuminate this aspect of prehistory. And I knew that it was going to mean, learning Russian, learning Ukrainian.
That's
two languages order. Not easy to master, and I certainly don't think that I mastered them yet. Maybe in a decade or so. But that was really the lead-in, was the, kind of getting all those other parts of European prehistory down, and then going into an area that we just didn't know much about because no one speaks the language.
Yeah.
And so when I was looking at PhD programs, it really came down to just a few, and the University of Pittsburgh and working with Professor Brian Hanks was, pretty much a godsend because he has a project in Russia. He's fairly well known in terms of the broader Eurasian steppe. And, this was back in 2006. So he had just finished his PhD at Cambridge. So, that was, if you're going to work over there, you gotta have someone who already has a project there, who's already known. You can't, it's not an easy place to just
wing it and find your own permitting and contacts and everything.
Yeah, well, and that's the thing is that, so especially in Ukraine, they expect that you've mastered the material already.
Yeah.
What the culture history, the archaeology, the ancient history, all of that. So I began very slowly developing the project in Ukraine with my colleague, Dr. Sergei Makortik at the Institute of Archaeology. And that was the plan for the PhD, that I would focus on basically the Scythian Iron Age in the Pontic Steppe.
Yeah.
But because we were having problems getting funding, Brian Hanks suggested that I do my PhD in Russia on his project, which got me into the Bronze Age.
And this ended up being much further east, right?
So yeah, much farther east. So the
just south
Bronze Age Russian project is in the southern Urals.
Yeah, so you're kind of near that gap between the Urals and the border of Kazakhstan then, right?
Yep. Yeah, so we're just under 40 miles away from the Kazakh border.
What did that project entail?
Yeah, so at the time, Brian Hanks was looking at metal production in Middle Bronze Age Sintashta period communities. So he had just gotten his National Science Foundation grant, his first one. So he had gone in 2008 with a team. I joined in 2009. And we were excavating at the Sintashta period settlement of Stepnoya, looking at basically the level of craft production related to metallurgy, and to a certain extent the effects.
What's the scale of a settlement like that?
So Stepnoya is roughly, I want to say, about 1.2 hectares, 1.5 maybe. Chernorechia, so there's two Sintashta settlements, Sintashta period settlements in that river valley. They're about 20 kilometers apart. Chernorechia is a little bit smaller. Bigger houses, but smaller.
Are there population estimates? Is it pretty rough?
Yeah, they're kind of all over the place. So, yeah, I mean, it can go anywhere from 200 to 1,200 for Stepnoya, and Chernorechia is a bit smaller.
It's a real town.
Yeah, we're talking real towns, not villages.
Yeah.
And of course, this, we have to think in terms of the phases, the construction phases and occupational phases, which there were at least 2, maybe 3. But yeah, we were excavating part of a house structure, a midden, a well, and basically looking for furnaces to give us evidence of the metallurgy.
And that metallurgy, is that creeping up from the Near East via, say, like the Caucasus Mountains? This is all kind of emerging organically?
Yeah.
That's really cool.
Yeah. So, I mean, we're talking about, when bronze is first being, and this is arsenical bronze being produced, so really in the early Bronze Age, so anywhere between 3,300 to 2,500 or 2,600 BC. And then in the Middle Bronze Age, a little bit more intensive production. And this was kind of the dominant model, especially for the Sintashta period, because this is a cultural group and a time period where we're seeing lots of innovations.
Yeah.
So the first time that we see permanent settlements on the steppe is with the Sintashta culture. We see chariots, and this may play into later questions because it's such a big topic. Of course, horse domestication.
Right. Both of those came from the eastern end of the steppe, right? To the degree that we can tell, chariots and.
Well, I mean, I don't want to say eastern ends of really anything.
Yeah. Because
the southern Urals is kind of its own thing.
Right. Yeah. It's not just a periphery of another area.
Yeah. Eastern or western. It's central.
Yeah.
Plus, I mean, the Ural Mountains is central to the Eurasian steppe.
Yeah.
We basically treat it as a dividing line. So west of it is, basically from the Urals to Bulgaria.
Yeah.
And then to the east of it, the steppe runs from the southern Urals to basically northern Korea.
Yeah.
So, the southern Urals is really a place of innovation, technological and, if not social innovation. And these things are just really starting to pick up kind of speed in terms of looking at chariots. And Sintashta culture, from what we know, and based on the radiocarbon dating, we have the earliest examples of chariots. And by chariots, we mean spoke-wheeled,
right, as
horse-drawn
opposed to just
carts.
a wagon or a cart.
Yeah. And then, of course, horse domestication probably was happening somewhere in there, probably a little bit earlier, maybe at Botai. So, yeah, that region is definitely, there's some pretty special things going on.
And urbanization is taking place incrementally over this period?
Yeah, so urbanization or urbanism, this is kind of a tricky thing because, well, one, we have to separate urbanization from urbanism. Urbanism being kind of an urban way of life.
Right.
Versus urbanization where populations are becoming centralized and growing, becoming denser. There are different takes on what's going on in the Middle Bronze Age Sintashta period. Like, is this proto-urbanism? Is this a proto-state?
Yeah.
How closely connected are they? Are these towns big enough? And this is, a question that my colleagues, he just passed away, but Gennady Zdanovich was asking early on in the 90s, basically up to the point that he passed away just a year and a half ago. Or like Andrei Epimakov, who's been asking about the demographics related to this. So probably the safest thing to say about the Sintashta period and those settlements is that they're kind of nascent urbanism. Because I think what I've often run into talking to other anthropological archaeologists is that they still don't think pastoralists are capable of urbanism, really in any form. So there's still that lingering impression that pastoral societies are
They're
complex.
the periphery. They're sort of the barbaric prehistory, and it's just sort of a footnote to the historic period in other areas.
Yeah, and usually the way we think of urbanism, or we're almost trained to think this way in terms of urbanization and urbanism, is that it's really a sign of the state. In either nascent states or developed states, whether it's happening in prehistory or historical times. And that's one of the things that my colleague Brian Miller and I have been trying to combat. So we're going to be publishing on this shortly. We actually have a rough draft done now, looking at what we call pastoral urbanism.
What distinguishes pastoral urbanism?
Well, basically, you have to take into account mobility, that these sites may not be permanent. So that, can we think of, let's say, tent cities,
right,
or yurts, or gers, in a dense enough concentration? And of course, there has to be some sort of signature, archaeological signature that can be picked up. So post holes, ceramics, blah blah blah. The list goes on. How does that differ from our kind of normative way of thinking about urbanization and urbanism?
So in some ways it's more ephemeral, or has the potential to be.
Definitely.
So,
Definitely.
Is it harder than excavating, like at Sintashta sites? Is it difficult to find the footprints of architectural features and things like that?
For the Sintashta, no, because we have embankments that were probably treated as fortifications. We don't know for certain, and certainly I've had this discussion with my kind of senior colleagues, because they just interpret them like as a default that they're fortifications, but embankments can be any number of things.
Yeah. But these are things you could...
But certainly we have the architectural kind of footprint.
And these are things you might even see walking onto a site before it's excavated?
Yes. Yeah. But the other kind of side of this, or the other dimension, is in 2011, I went out and did to the best of my knowledge, the first regional pedestrian survey, systematic pedestrian survey on the Russian steppe. So I know that my colleagues in Mongolia had also been doing something similar before that.
Yeah. This is something that you had mentioned to me a while ago, which completely blew my mind, that in Russia, pedestrian survey is not a very common or ordinary form of archaeological project.
No,
right?
even now, and there, after I finished my PhD at the University of Pittsburgh, there was another student who did a smaller survey.
Yeah.
But, and again, turned up quite a bit. And it's interesting because both surveys were extremely productive.
Yeah.
They identified things in the landscape that our Russian colleagues would never have found or didn't know about.
Yeah.
And certainly if we think about the historical conditioning involved in settlements like the Sintashta settlements, we have a better idea of what leads up to these things, whether it's migration or local developments. But yeah, and it's not uncommon that regional pedestrian systematic survey isn't employed. It's not employed that often in Europe either.
Really?
Yeah. I mean, they do field walking, but there's just not a lot of survey happening unless it's usually American or a few British teams conducting it.
So how good then is our understanding of, say, the distribution of Sintashta sites, or how that complex is laid out on the landscape? Do we just have a couple little islands of knowledge in the midst of a sea of ignorance, or what?
Well, no, I think we have a really good idea because besides survey, you also have other kind of techniques or methods to looking at landscapes. And what the Russians are, I think, particularly good at is aerial photography.
Oh, interesting.
And the analysis of it. And especially my co-director, Natasha Batanina, she spent a large portion of her career, along with her grandmother and her father, and they're kind of an archaeological dynasty in this part of Russia. And they really have focused on the analysis of aerial photography. So that Natasha identified a 22nd or 23rd Sintashta settlement.
Wow.
And now she just found a rather large late Bronze Age settlement outside of my survey study area. So she and I are very interested in going to explore that, through survey and excavation. Yeah. So, there's different ways of doing this, and we can be, I think, really confident in what they've found. So we found, the 20-plus Sintashta settlements, these kind of possibly fortified settlements, and they really range in size, anywhere from half a hectare up to, 3 hectares or 4 hectares. So, some of them are fairly large, and they have large cemeteries associated with them as well. Almost each, I think pretty much every settlement has a cemetery associated with it.
It might be good at this point to ask, I think, a question about what gave me the most trouble doing the reading related to this interview, which is most of the books. Yeah.
So I have a feeling we're about to get into the culture history.
Yep. So doing the reading for this interview, I found a really bewildering array of culture historical groups and complexes.
Yeah.
Incredibly detailed chronologies with very, to my ear, not speaking any Russian or Ukrainian, very complexes that are impossible to tell the difference between because they all have very long hyphenated Russian names and Ukrainian names. And it's hard to get a mental map for exactly what's changing across the Bronze Age. Are there any broader schema that you like, or shorthands that help you think of what, say, the difference between an early and middle Bronze Age site are characterized by?
Yeah, so pretty much I can delineate the Bronze Age altogether, so early, middle, late, final.
Yeah.
And the best way to think about that without getting bogged down in too many specifics, is thinking about the changes to settlements. Mm-hmm. So with the early Bronze Age, we're generally talking that we don't have a lot of settlement information. Mm-hmm. Michael Frascetti has suggested that this is the time where mobile pastoralism is really coming into play. And I completely agree. David Anthony is suggesting that the groups in the early Bronze Age are wagon dwellers. And so they're moving across the landscape. This may or may not coincide with domestication of the horse. These may be oxen pulled or cattle pulled wagons. So we don't have a lot of settlement information. In fact, most sites are characterized by the absence of what we would think of as permanent settlement. With the Middle Bronze Age, we basically see and I would say middle Bronze Age. So with the emergence of a couple of different cultural groups, including the Sintashta, we begin to see more permanent settlements. Mm-hmm. And I think a dominant question right now is, were they lived in year round, or were they utilized in let's say winters? Because we know that overall, like the Potopovka and the Sintashta are pastoralists. They have herds. The question is, what strategy are they using? Yeah. Are we talking about tethered, semi-tethered, or like what Michael Frascetti has said, mobile pastoralism, which is pretty much you're on the move. Certainly with Sintashta, we would say it's either tethered or semi-tethered. And interestingly enough, in the Southern Urals, they still have this kind of pastoralism, where basically, in the morning, you bring your cattle out to a corral, and there are a herder or two, and they take them out for the day, and then they bring them in usually around 5 or 6 p.m. And then you come and get your cattle and bring them back. So each house has 2 or 3 cows. Yeah. And then the sheep and goats are herded within the settlement, like this modern settlement, village or town of Stepnoya. You can see them, the kind of livestock, the other livestock wandering around in herds, and usually they have dogs herding them. You don't need humans.
Yeah, you can do it all.
They've got this little yippy dog that runs around by the sheep especially, and it herds them around the outskirts of town.
From the Neolithic through the Bronze Age, there's this sense, at least that I grew up with reading history, that nothing interesting was happening outside of the Near East in these time periods, that it was just sort of a giant blank map of prehistory. And meanwhile, all the big cities and all the innovations and development are taking place in Mesopotamia, in Anatolia, in the Levant. And doing some of the reading for this interview has really been blowing my mind, just in terms of the scale of some of the Neolithic communities in Eastern Europe and Ukraine and Moldova, and going all the way east to Sintashta, with it being this emergent points for such transformative technologies. It seems like it's really flipped my image of the region on its head for this period.
Yeah, I think I was really lucky. I think in terms of meeting Bettina Arnold when I did, because working with her on kind of these European Iron Age, quote unquote Celtic developments, massive hill forts and cities appearing. We have such a better understanding now of these developments than we did when I first started out 22 years ago. We were working in cemetery, tumulus cemeteries that were considered hinterland. They're 4 or 5, 6 kilometers away from the major site of the Heunerberg. That really got my mind spinning in terms of what are the expectations for things out east. in Ukraine, in Russia,
Yeah.
in Kazakhstan. I think so many people are trained to think that civilization happens in the cradles.
Right.
Mesopotamia, China, and of course other parts of the world, but we don't often think about those societies.
The steppe is off the edge of the map.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Back then we were really struggling against this idea that pastoralists could be complex. And I think Brian and Kathy did such a great service to pastoral archaeology in general, basically taking that challenge head on, and gathering prominent scholars from around the world to say pastoralists are their own thing. They're not necessarily peripheral. They're not necessarily subject to, basically agrarian states. They have their own developments. And in fact, they're introducing things to these agrarian states.
Which honestly shouldn't really be a surprising point, right? Given the role of pastoral peoples historically as the prototypical outside threat, the great thorn in the side of these settled societies, from the Scythians and the Xiongnu to the Huns and the Mongols.
Yeah, I mean, that I think develops later on, because I think there's a more almost symbiotic relationship between pastoralists and agrarian societies. I don't want to say states, but societies in general. Because it's, as things progress, pastoralists definitely become a bit more territorial. And certainly by 1100, or we could even say 8400 with the Huns, pastoralists have become a dominant force in terms of world prehistory.
Yeah.
And it's amazing how many times I still hear, people refer to, Rome was the biggest empire, the largest empire and most impactful empire. And I'm like, no. That was the Mongols. Yeah. Without a doubt. There's no question. And then thinking about the Han Empire, there's still a lot of debate going on about the possibility of the Scythians being an empire or a state level society. Certainly colleagues of mine go back and forth. I'm pretty open to the idea that it's possible.
Yeah.
The problem is how we define empire and state. Usually you have to have a system of writing. But this gets us into talking about kind of relativity. And the simple fact is we know that, pastoralists are capable.
Yeah.
So we have to think about the possibility of it. And, we're, like I said, we're finding out more every day. More archaeological projects are happening. More surveys are happening. So the more we find out, I think more plausible the idea is that maybe the Scythians were empire state level.
Well, and here's another topic I wanted to ask about. If we're talking about the steppe's contribution to the world, then there's the subject of the Indo-European language family, and the fact that, correct me if I'm wrong, it likely originated on the steppe, and that'd be the source of French, Spanish, Latin, Hindi, Russian, the English we're using to make this podcast, at least according to the Kurgan hypothesis, right? And by the way, for our audience, the name Kurgan hypothesis just refers to iconic burial mounds found on the steppe.
Well, I wouldn't say it's necessarily the Kurgan hypothesis anymore. I think that's a related factor. So thinking about Gimbutas's Kurgan hypothesis, which I think in the 80s and 90s a lot of people were agreeing with, but I think we've kind of bifurcated the two between the Kurgan hypothesis and Proto-Indo-European in the Pontic-Caspian steppe area. Yeah. So Anatolian is still one of those competing hypotheses, though.
First suggested by Colin Renfrew.
Yeah. I think he was the first one to kind of systematize it.
Yeah. And this was the contention from Renfrew and others that Anatolia, modern-day Turkey, was the real home of Proto-Indo-European.
But
and
even within the last 5 years, he's backtracked.
Right. Yeah, that's what I had heard.
So I think right now, the dominant hypothesis is that Proto-Indo-European, so the pre-language to the Indo-European language families, occurred or was focused on the Pontic-Caspian steppe.
Would this be contemporaneous with Sintashta, or would this be earlier in the Neolithic?
This is earlier. So we're talking maybe 1,000 years earlier. So really between 3,500 and 3,000 BC, that's usually when we put pi, Proto-Indo-European. Now, the interesting thing is there's a lot going on at this time in terms of people moving around and societies basically breaking down. You had mentioned this earlier with the Neolithic, Neolithic groups in Ukraine and Moldova. So we're talking about Tripilia, Kukateni. So the simple fact is that that's a very long-lasting development, and we see various things happening between really about 4,800 BC and 2,800 BC. And right around that time that pi is supposedly emerging, the Tripilia settlements are undergoing fairly massive changes.
And these were, by any measure for the period, some of the largest settlements on Earth, right?
Yes. Yeah. So, I mean, they're comparative, well, at least a couple of them are in comparison to like Uruk, roughly around the same size. So 450 hectares.
Jeez.
So fairly big.
Yeah.
But they're very different as well. There's a massive open space in most of these settlements. So they have basically concentric rings of house structures and structures in general. So we're not sure what those open spaces are. And we also see something similar for most of the Sintashta settlements.
Really, the same
big
spatial
open spaces. Yeah. Especially if we look at the eponymous Sintashta settlement, Archaim, which is probably the best known, and a few others. They're circular, they have concentric rings of houses, and then they have a large open space. And I don't want to suggest cultural diffusion or anything like that.
Yeah.
That may have just been, a dominant kind of idea.
Yeah,
for
just
that
some sort of shared motif.
Yeah.
And I guess that kind of goes to monumentality then. It's an absence of a structure rather than a structure. But if it's a
open space,
centralized landmark,
then
it would have played a pretty similar role in some sense, right?
Yeah. I think there's been a few scholars, I know I've talked about it at various conferences, that basically we do have these monumental open spaces. So it may be that we have to change our thinking in terms of monumentality.
Yeah.
The settlements themselves are big, if not massive.
Yeah.
But these big open spaces seem to have been fairly important. I mean, we can think, and again, I don't want to talk about cultural diffusion, but we see very early on from the Neolithic into the Bronze Age across Europe, across Eurasia, big open spaces seem to be, but confined, meaning delineated, usually by house structures or other types of monuments. Those open spaces are key to what's happening, probably ritual, or default.
It's a good catch-all.
But talking about the Proto-Indo-European, certainly around 3,500, we began to see basically the language groups emerging.
I'm kind of curious as to the sort of artifacts that you pull out of the ground at the sites you've worked at, just in terms of adding a little color to, my own mental image of these places. I guess, what are some evocative things that you've pulled out of the ground?
Well, I would say, one, we find a fair amount of pottery. So here at the University of Wyoming, no one really talks about pottery.
No one talks about pottery.
So I often, my first talk here was all about pottery.
Yeah.
So that got people thinking in interesting ways about pottery. But for me, I don't know. I can't explain why I get excited by pottery, but there's just things kind of popping up. There's bronze awls and talc that's used in the talc? Pottery. So talc is a magnesium silicate. It gets processed and used as a temper in the pottery. We also find other bits of mica that look very similar to the talc. And it was interesting because I've been focused on this for almost a decade now, even though I haven't really published that much on it. Not yet. Yeah. That's coming out. But in our excavations at this kind of Middle Bronze Age, Late Bronze Age settlement of Chernarechia II in southern Urals in the Uy River Valley, we've basically confirmed my ideas about processing talc, and now we know that it wasn't just talc, it's mica as well, and it's being used in very specific ways. And I don't want to talk about it too much until I publish it, but yeah, certainly pottery is being used in a fashion that almost goes against what we learn about pastoral societies. One, they don't have as much material culture as agrarian societies, because if you're moving around, you don't want things to break. With especially the Sintashta, but this goes into the late Bronze Age as well, pottery's being repaired with bronze staples, even though once you break that pot, you basically can't use it in terms of...
Yeah, it can't hold water.
Yeah, it can't hold, well, really any liquids.
Yeah.
And even if you were, let's say, collecting wild plants like Chenopodium, which now we know is a thing as well, it wouldn't hold it that well because the seeds are so small, they're going to get through that crack. So there's some sort of, I hate to go back to it again, but ritual aspect to this, that there's a lot of investment.
Yeah.
A lot of interest in keeping the pots together. And this probably was more symbolic than functional. So was kind of my starting point in looking at the pots. Because I remember my colleague, Lena Kupernova, basically taking me through the Sintashta pottery room at the local university in Chelyabinsk.
Yeah.
And, we're talking about it. I can see, some of the sherds are exfoliated, so the paste is visible.
Yeah.
And I could see all the tempers. And then a lot of them had those bronze staples. They were holding the pots together. Especially when the pots are found in kind of ritual context, especially burial context. So that really kind of excited my imagination in terms of what's going on with these pastoral societies beyond things like urbanism and all of that. So more kind of on the ground, focused on material culture. But we find a lot of things. What we're identifying now is that the Middle Bronze Age and Late Bronze Age settlements are usually sitting directly on top of Mesolithic and Neolithic settlements. So we find a lot of
that's also
lithic
not
material.
Something that I would imagine with my view of pastoralists and semi-nomadic and nomadic societies generally.
Yeah, well, it does suggest a degree of continuity in the occupation of the landscape. But why are they just focused on those sites? I mean, you're pastoral, you don't have to be focused on, kind of reoccupying those sites or continually occupying those sites. So that's, I think, a big, interesting question that we're going to be looking at, and certainly if I'm writing grants about it now.
Why are people reoccupying sites
exactly.
when they
from
don't
the
have
Mesolithic up to basically the final Bronze Age? And in fact, most of the villages and towns are sitting on top of those prehistoric settlements.
Are there any I mean, you're probably still kind of thinking about this, but are there sort of utilitarian elements to some of these sites? Are they located on promontories, or do they have good access to a water source? Or
like I said, they're all close to water sources. And the
Because
Uy
they
River
have to
Valley
be.
has no shortage of natural springs. The river is basically flowing out of the Ural Mountain Range, so there's
Yeah.
fresh, cold water available. I can think of at least 3 springs in the part of the river valley that's my study area.
Yeah.
There's seasonal drainages that you can see on any Google map.
Yeah.
So there's no shortage of water, and certainly even in the Bronze Age, there doesn't seem to have been any shortage of water. They're located pretty close. They're usually right on the river.
Mm-hmm.
So they're also, so it's a steppe, and things do get fairly dry in the summer. Usually by June or July, things are getting a little brownish, unless you're really close to the river. So what a lot of the modern herders are doing are going up and then back. So going beyond the river and then coming back to it to feed. So to not overexploit that lush grass that's pretty close to the river. Chances are that's what was going on in the middle, late, final Bronze Age as well. So, the settlements are definitely located in prime areas, but it's kind of flat, not as flat as what we think. I think people that haven't been to that part of the steppe, we often characterize it, it must be flat, arid,
If you had
dry.
if you had to pick a state in the U.S. to compare it to, what would you pick?
Maybe western Nebraska. Wyoming's pretty close, pretty similar environment.
Pretty arid, pretty mountainous.
But I mean, where we are, we're a bit farther away from the mountains. So you can see them in the distance, but whereas here it's like a 40-minute drive to the mountains, unless we're talking about the South Laramie Range. There it's more like a 2-hour drive.
Okay.
So we're really in the foothills of the Ural Mountain Range. So I mean, it's well known for its resources, mineral resources especially. So mining, lots of mining activity going on. And this is kind of the forest steppe border as well. So basically, when we come down from Chelyabinsk into Stepnoya, you're crossing into the steppe. So you kind of come over a ridge and through the forest, and then you see the steppe open up.
And that's kind of an important boundary across the whole of the West Eurasian steppe, right? Running from Ukraine east is basically, as you get far enough north, you start creeping into the forest, right?
Right.
Is that boundary characterized by any amount of friction or very discrete sort of breaks in cultural complexes and things like that?
Yeah. So, one of the ideas for like Sintashta is that they were migrants that came in and settled, and then basically they were interacting with local hunter-gatherer groups, and that's still a possibility.
Is there any genetic work that's been done, or
not that I can talk about?
Aha.
So unfortunately, it's not published yet. So we'll find
cool.
out more later. And that's kind of the way of archaeology. We'll find out more later.
People are working on it.
Yeah. So people are asking those questions. We're starting to look at the material, skeletal material and genetic material. So that's definitely a possibility, because in the forest steppe there are distinct cultural groups, along the lines of culture history, and we think that probably like the Sintashta and the later groups, the Alakul and Fedorovo, and are still interacting with these groups, if not intermarrying, because of course, you have to keep your gene pool fairly wide and deep. This is one of David Anthony's kind of burgeoning interests, is thinking more along the lines of gene pools and marriage alliances. How do you keep yourself genetically fit in terms of communities? And that's something that should be testable genetically.
if I'm in a village on the steppe in this period, let's say there's 400 or 600 people, how far do I have to go to get to the next settlement of that scale?
So, the distances are varied. So if we're in Stepnoia, Middle Bronze Age, Sintashta period, Stepnoia, the next settlement, contemporary settlement, is Chernarechia 3. Mm-hmm. So that's 20 kilometers away.
Oh, that's not terrible.
But
it's a walk, but
Chernarechia 3 and Stepnoia are the northernmost Sintashta settlements. You basically have to go 70 or 80 kilometers to the south to reach the next one.
Really?
Yeah.
So, I guess, is there greater evidence of mining and resource extraction of any kind? Or
we don't really know that yet, because even though that's been kind of a persistent question over the last 30 years, without doing survey, you can't really answer those questions.
Yeah.
Certainly, in the like Evgeny Chernik has proposed, different metallurgical provinces, but really the Sintashta all fall under one, so we don't know exactly what's happening between the settlements. Mm-hmm. Certainly, Stepnoia seems more focused on production than Chernarechia, but
production of
metal.
Okay, yeah.
But again, that's based on very limited information, mm-hmm. and we're just finding out more now. Certainly, or I should say, my project's excavations in 2019, we just didn't find much related to metal production. We certainly found a lot about pottery production, bone and antler tool production, lithics, but again, going mostly back to the Mesolithic and Neolithic, and a lot of animal bone, but not a lot telling us about metal production. So we did find slag, a decent amount.
Yeah.
Not as much as what I would have expected if this late Bronze Age, kind of Middle Bronze Age, but primarily late Bronze Age site was being used for intensive craft production focused on metallurgy.
At what point on the steppe do we see a transition from the, more small-scale production of arsenical bronze to the safer and more cost-effective production of bronze as an alloy of copper and tin?
Yeah, certainly I think by the Middle Bronze Age, Sintashta period, so around 2100 BC, what we're seeing is fairly low levels of bronze production in terms of smeltings per year.
Yeah.
So Brian Hanks and his colleague Roger Doonan have, we've published on this. As far as the transition from arsenic to tin, I would say the safest thing is to say it's happening in the late Bronze Age, probably by the end of the Middle Bronze Age Sintashta period, so around mm-hmm. 1800 BC. Mm-hmm. But I'm not familiar enough with all of the settlements in what we often refer to as Sintashta land to know exactly when they're making that transition. While tin was certainly much safer, the problem is it generally has to be imported. Mm-hmm. So there aren't a lot of tin sources across the steppe or in Europe or even in the Middle East or Near East. Mm-hmm. There are open questions about like bronze production, even copper production in terms mm-hmm. of producing copper ingots that may have been traded to different, kind of state level societies or kingdoms to the south and east and west. And that's like Christian Christiansen and David Anthony have suggested repeatedly that this must have been happening in the Middle Bronze Age Sintashta, that they were focused on intensive bronze production or copper production. But really, the only solid evidence that we have of that is during the late Bronze Age. Mm-hmm. So
there's just expectations that it goes back further than we have yet found.
Yeah, but we haven't found any evidence to suggest that. What I've said kind of in my talks and whatever, that the safest thing to assume is that this is happening in the late Bronze Age, especially with the breakdown of Sintashta communities. We also see the dispersion of chariot technologies. So a lot of these societies are coming into contact with one another.
When you say the breakdown of Sintashta communities, what do you mean?
A lot of the Sintashta period communities, so these Middle Bronze Age communities, break down, meaning the communities break down. So we see population dispersal to a certain extent. Around 1800, really anywhere between 1900 and 1700 BC. Some of these sites are reoccupied during the late Bronze Age, but there's not a lot of radiocarbon dating, so we don't know specific timing of this, but certainly we see overall in the late Bronze Age, populations are scattering across the landscape. Some are relocating settlements.
Is there increased evidence for violence and fortifications and things around that time?
Nope. In fact, the late Bronze Age is pretty much characterized by the absence of fortifications. Not complete absence, because you see it in a few examples. But like in the Uy River Valley, we see these late Bronze Age settlements pop up. And for the first time, we also see kind of center-hinterland dynamics coming up in the late Bronze Age. So, in some cases, what could be much larger settlements happening in the late Bronze Age. And this has been kind of an underexplored possibility for the steppe late Bronze Age, because we often think about population dispersal, smaller communities, all of that, but that's certainly not what we're seeing in the southern Urals.
What do you most want to know going forward? Like, what are your plans in the next few years?
Well, I think there's, and I share this interest with Brian Hanks about what's going on metallurgically.
Yeah.
And what's the transition from the Sintashta period into the late Bronze Age, so Lockwell groups. But also, I'm really focused on those damn ceramics. I think there's so many things really interesting about pastoralists using pottery, producing and using pottery. And I think that's kind of, if not a reflection, definitely related to how they saw themselves.
Does that tie in too to this sort of surprising degree of reuse of sites? If I make a bunch of pottery and I know I'm never coming back to the place where I made them, and now I have to carry all the pottery, it seems like I would be discouraged from making it. Whereas if I know I'm coming back next season or a few seasons down the road, and it might still be there when I get back, is that a possibility?
Yeah, definitely. I think that there's, when we think of social change, we often think about kind of complete social change, complete transformation. Mm-hmm. But we know, ethnographically, that's not really how social change works, that there's aspects of change and continuity happening. Mm-hmm. So one of the things that I think is the most interesting and something that sets me apart from my colleagues, especially here at Wyoming, is thinking about social memory, but also thinking about avoidance and forgetting. It seems like there were different reactions to basically breakdown or relocation, or basically reoccupying these sites in terms of, in some examples or some cases, we see that the late Bronze Age communities are avoiding the Sintashta period settlements.
Really?
Yeah. But in other cases, they're reoccupying them. And one of the things that I'm looking at, pun intended, is visibility of the late Bronze Age settlements in terms of where the Middle Bronze Age Sintashta period settlements are located. So I've been working on this since I was a postdoc in Denmark, basically through GIS.
Yeah.
And there's some interesting things coming out.
Well, thanks for taking the time, Jim.
Yeah.
I really appreciate it.
Yeah, you're welcome.
And thank you for listening to this episode of The Tell. Until next time. Hey everybody. If you enjoyed the podcast and you want to help me talk to more people in more places, please consider donating. You can do so on my Patreon as a recurring donor, as well as on my website if you'd rather do a one-time donation. The links are patreon.com/Sebastian Weatherby and www.sebastianweatherby.com. Show notes are also available on my website, where you can find citations and comments and other relevant information about the things we talked about today. Thanks again for listening.